Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you here this evening. Thank you so much for coming, and we have prepared a very, very special program for you, some very special guests. We're very lucky that the weather cooperated with us. As you know, it's been a little on the wet side lately, so worked out well. There's a new movie out. Many of you may have already seen this movie, What the Bleep Do We Know? It is just absolutely fabulous. Beautiful piece done. And luckily tonight we have the scientists that actually participated in making that movie, along with Dr. Michael Lightman, a Kabbalist from Tel Aviv, Israel, with an organization called B'nai Baruch. We're going to speak just a minute about them. The speakers will be speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes apiece. The first will be Dr. William Tiller. Dr. Tiller received his PhD from University of Toronto. He worked 9 years for the Westinghouse Research Laboratory with theoretical and experimental investigation into detailed physics of the freezing processes of materials. Dr. Tiller has also been a professor for Stanford University in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering, and a consultant to the government and industry in the fields of metallurgy and solid-state physics. He's published more than 250 scientific papers, 3 technical books, and has 5 patents issued.
The next guest is Dr. Jeffrey Satinover, who specializes in psychiatry, physics, and is a doctoral candidate in physics. For over 20 years, Dr. Satinover has been an author and practicing psychiatrist. He was until recently a teaching fellow and doctoral student in the Department of Physics at Yale University, where he has completed a master's degree as a member of the theoretical condensed matter physics group. He is presently completing the doctorate in physics, pursuing new techniques in the prediction of chaotic time series with applications to biological systems, climate change, and markets.
We'll also have Dr. Fred Alan Wolf. Dr. Wolf's a physicist and writer and lecturer who earned his PhD from University of California at Los Angeles in 1963. His work is in quantum physics, and consciousness is well known through his popular and scientific writing. He is an author of 11 books, and Dr. Wolf has challenged minds at the San Diego State University, the University of Paris, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the University of London, Birkbeck College, and many other institutions of higher learning. Dr. Wolf is best known for his contributions through technical papers and popular books, and he is frequently in demand as a lecturer, a keynote speaker, and consultant to industry and media. And our final speaker will be Dr. Michael Lightman, Kabbalist from Tel Aviv, Israel. Dr. Lightman was from Russia. He attended the Electrotechnical Institute for Higher Studies of the St. Petersburg State Polytechnic University, which was formerly the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute, in the Faculty of Biological Medical Cybernetics. During his formal studies, he conducted medical research at the Institute of Hematology. In 1974, Dr. Lightman migrated to Israel and studied under Rabbi Baruch Ashlag, who is the son of Yehuda Ashlag, Bahasalam, the famous master of the ladder, Kabbalist. The order of the speakers this evening will be first Dr. Tiller, then Dr. Wolf, then Dr. Satinover, and finally Dr. Lightman. At the end of that period of all of the speakers, there'll be a period where you can submit questions. If you have anything that you would like to write down a question on and submit it to us, we'll be happy to present it to the speakers, and they'll be happy to answer your questions for you. Also, one last announcement, and that is that of the books that are for sale outside, 20% of the profits of those books is being donated to the community school here. And without further ado, we'll start with Dr. Tiller.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to be here. In the intro, the conventional pursuits were listed. About 1970, I started a second branch of my activities, which I call psychoenergetics. And over the last 35 years in that area, I have published 3 books and about 130 scientific papers. And that's really what I'm going to talk about tonight from the psychoenergetics point of view and distinguish it from conventional establishment physics that I did every day at Stanford for 34 years. Now, so you can see what perspective I'm taking to look at this. To me, we are all spirits having a physical experience as we ride the river of life together. Our spiritual parents dressed us in these bio-body suits and put us in this playpen, which we call the universe, in order to grow in coherence, in order to develop our gifts of intentionality, and in order to become what we're intended to become, co-creators with our spiritual parents. So now you can see my bias. I want to talk tonight in the time available about 3 misconceptions in science. The first misconception is an unstated assumption that has been present in the paradigm of classical mechanics and is still holding over to the present paradigm of quantum mechanics. And that unstated paradigm is that no human quality of consciousness, intention, emotion, mind, or spirit can significantly influence a well-designed target experiment in physical reality. And our work set out to prove that to be very, very wrong. I thought I would use an overhead projector, but it seems I'm not, so I will just give it to you verbally. What we did to test this hypothesis of the unstated assumption was to take 2 identical low-tech electronic devices, little black boxes, 7 inches by 3 inches by 1 inch, and separated one as the control and set the other on a tabletop around which 4 well-qualified meditators sat. And they went into a deep meditation, cleansed the area mentally, and then one would state the specific intention for that device to be used with a conjugate target experiment. Each statement was given of the intention. For example, one of the target experiments was to increase the pH of water, purified water, in equilibrium with air with no chemical additions by 1 full pH unit with a measurement accuracy of better than 1/100th of a pH unit. So the intention was to have a signature which was at least 100 times larger than the noise. So a very robust result was expected. And so the group would hold the specific intention. And if I can remember it, it goes something like this. Our intention is to activate the indwelling spirit of the space so as to raise the electromagnetic gauge symmetry state of the space to a significant level above our normal background and to tune it so that the pH of purified water placed in that space would increase by 1 full pH unit. That was basically the intention. And then there was a subsidiary intention to seal in the prime directive. And then basically at the end of each of these intention statements, the phrase was given, "So be it, thy will be done." And so at the end of maybe 15 minutes, the group would come out of meditation. Someone who was sufficiently sensitive would feel the devices, and if they felt cooked, then that would be it. But generally, just to be sure, it was done twice. Never needed to be done more than twice. Now, the first thing that we observed before sending it off to Minnesota, where the target experiments were set up, we did the initial work while I was still at Stanford, we placed what we called the unimprinted electrical device, a UED, and the intention imprinted electrical device, which we called an IIED. We set them 300 meters apart, and we turned them off electrically. And we noted that within about 3 days, the unimprinted device had picked up the imprint from the imprinted device. And although we didn't appreciate it enough at the time, that indicates that there is another information channel available in the universe beyond electromagnetism that we use so much in our technological society today. And what we had to do in order to be able to do experiments is we had to find a way of blocking this transfer, at least to some degree. And the way we did it was to wrap the device in aluminum foil and put it in an electrically grounded Faraday cage. So whatever was this new energy and this new communication channel, it did interact with conventional electromagnetism and could be dissipated that way. So there were 4 target experiments. I'll go through them quickly. One was to raise the pH of this purified water by 1 full pH unit. No chemical additions. The second was to reduce the pH of the same purified water by 1 pH unit. And as most of you know, our bodies have a particular pH. If you go a half a pH unit on one side, you're close to death. If you go a half a pH unit the other side, you're close to death. So 1 pH unit is a significant amount. It's a factor of 10 in hydrogen ion concentration. The third target experiment was to move to the biological domain and pick a particular liver enzyme called alkaline phosphatase and to increase the thermodynamic activity by a significant degree. The fourth target experiment was to take a living system, fruit fly larva, and the intention was to increase the ATP to ADP ratio in the cells of the fruit fly larva so there would be a greater storage of energy, and therefore they would be more fit, and therefore they would have a shorter larval development time to the adult fly stage. Now, in terms of the results, with both pH experiments, both up and down of the same water, we were eminently successful. The third experiment, we were able to increase the thermodynamic activity of the liver enzyme by about 25%. And we did the experiment with a set of controls, all sort of in situ. And that 25% occurred with a p-value of better than 1 part in 1,000. So the possibility of it occurring by random chance was very small. With the fruit fly larva, we found indeed that the ATP to ADP increased significantly, the order of 20%, and the larval development time was reduced by the order of 15 to 20%. And again, all of this was with a p-value of better than 1 part in 1,000. So these were very robust results and proved to us that the unstated assumption was very, very wrong. Now, we noticed during the course of these experiments, it took some months to do these experiments, we found if I was to make it's hard, what we felt was going on, that the space was being conditioned to some higher state, so that if we were to plot the change in the property value as a function of time with respect to the presence of the IIED being turned on, then for the first month or so, you got the normal value. And then there was a transition period where the value would rise if the pH was to rise, and it would go down if the pH was to go down. And it would ultimately reach a plateau. And after a while it was on that plateau, this occurred generally about 3 months later. And invariably, at least for the water experiments, the pH, changing by 1 pH unit, was at that plateau. And we could take the device away from the room at that point in time, and we could put it in an electrically grounded Faraday cage, and the system would maintain. And we have found such systems can maintain for several years. So there was a real difference that occurred in the space, and we began to probe the difference. And the first experiment we did was to take the vessel containing the pH electrode and a temperature probe, and we put underneath it a disc-shaped DC magnet. Okay, the kind of things you put on your refrigerator, only a little bigger. So first with the North Pole up, and you record data for the order of 3 or 4 days, and then you just turn it around so the South Pole is facing up, and record data for 3 or 4 days. Now that is quite heretical, because in our conventional reality, we have only magnetic dipoles. We do not have magnetic monopoles as we have electric monopoles. And we also have electric dipoles. But if you have only a magnetic dipole, it says it doesn't matter which end is up, the north or the south pole, you have the same magnetic field, so the magnetic energy is the same and the magnetic force is the same. So a conventional establishment physicist would say, that's ridiculous. Why did you do that experiment? Well, if we do that experiment in a normal space, probably like here on this auditorium, there may be some difference now, but nonetheless, in the empty auditorium, we would see no difference. But in this conditioned space, we saw differences in pH of half a pH unit, 1 pH unit, 1.5 pH units. Very, very different than expectations based upon conventional science. And if you begin to ask yourself, how might this possibly come about? The only meaningful hypothesis we have been able to come up with is that we're somehow accessing magnetic monopoles. Well, in exotic physics, there is a higher electromagnetic gauge symmetry state than our normal environment, which is called the SU2 state. And at that state, electric and magnetic monopoles are naturally supposed to coexist. Turns out a higher gauge symmetry state is also a higher thermodynamic free energy per unit volume state, which means that it can do useful work of any type on a system that is at a lower thermodynamic state. And we were getting these great results in what appeared to be physical reality with our instrumentation. And so it seems not unreasonable that if in fact you've created a system of higher thermodynamic free energy and you're accessing another domain of physics where magnetic monopoles are involved, then the physics can be altered in such a way as to give rise to this result from intention, which says a second thing. It says that whatever this new energy is, it can be modulated by intention, human intention, which is very interesting. The next phase was to do replication experiments, when we took the pH increasing by 1 pH unit as our target, and in 4 laboratories in the U.S., the experiments being done by others, and 2 laboratories in Europe, they replicated this result. Now what we did is we had delivered to them equipment from the manufacturer, and we had delivered to them highly purified water from Fisher Scientific, and we told them how to put it together and make the measurements, but we tried to stay out of it as much as possible. In fact, we wanted to gather the data from them, and we said, send it to us by snail mail on diskette. And so we would analyze the data and then send them back the results. Now, the interesting thing about this, what we did was to ask them to do the experiment in cycles. That is, let's say we would replace the water every week, and we would recalibrate the electrode every week. So the stage would be that with the first vessel of water, the purified water, the pH would come from its starting point down to the theoretical value for the normal symmetry state, and then it would start to rise a little bit. And at the end of that week, you'd change the water and recalibrate. And in the second week, the same thing happened. The pH would come down to the baseline of the normal theoretical value, and then it would climb, and it always climbed exponentially, and it climbed to a larger value of the delta pH. And week after week, it went up and up and up and up until it asymptotically went to 1 pH unit. Now, that was all well and good. This took place in the presence of the IED, but we also set up control sites 2 to 20 miles away, and lo and behold, we found the same kind of behavior there. Well, that was very, very interesting. So it says whatever this new energy is, it is very, very difficult to shield it, and distance doesn't seem to be much of a problem, but let's test that out a little further. The next two sites that came online, which were in Bethesda and Baltimore, they were 1,000 to 2,000 miles away from our Payson lab or the Missouri or Kansas sites. And within a couple of months, the same behavior occurred there. And then we had contact from a group of young people in England, and a couple of months later from a group of young people in Italy who wanted to get in the game, and we said, well, all right, this is the equipment you should purchase, but gather background data first, and then we'll send you an IED. Well, in England, which went online first, within 3 weeks, the pH had gone up 1 full pH unit, and 2 months later, when the Italian one went online, within 1 week, it was 1.1 pH units, and in 3 weeks, it was 1.7 pH units. And the interesting thing about that site was it was below ground. Well, one of our control sites, the one in Missouri, was also below ground, and it got 1.7 pH units. As we looked at the data, all the sites that were at ground level, they got 1 pH unit. And those that were 3 stories up in the air, such as at Bethesda and Baltimore, that got 0.8 pH units. So unlike electromagnetism, it seems to prefer, this new energy prefers to go through the ground rather than through the air, which is in itself is interesting. Now I'm going to wrap up quickly because the important point is we then went on to look at humans and studied kinesiologically with a real expert kinesiologist the strength of particular muscle groups. And when we brought a south pole of a magnet near the muscle group, it was strengthened. When we brought the north pole near, it was weakened. So again, there's a DC magnetic field polarity effect involved. And the body system that is very much involved in the strength of muscles is the acupuncture meridian chakra system. So it says to me that all humans have their acupuncture meridian chakra system at this higher gauge symmetry level, and intentions can modulate the chi flow in that system, because I suspect that really we're talking about chi. And from that level, it can drive all the processes and all the organs of the normal U1 gauge level of the body. So human electromagnetism is not Maxwellian. It's not the conventional U1 gauge electromagnetism. It is a hybrid of that plus this higher level of I call it magnetoelectrism for a word. Well, I think I've probably overspent my time. The other two misconceptions will have to wait till another time, so I give my colleagues the chance. But I wanted to fill you in on this first part, which indicates that humans are much, much more than we have been led to believe that they are, and that they have the capacity, the internal capacity, to build this system like building internal muscles rather than external muscles, so that normal folks can become adepts and then masters and then avatars. And that's where you're all going, folks. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Wolf.
I really don't know what I'm going to say to you. It's not uncommon for me. The first time I went to Israel, I went into a restaurant and I overheard everybody saying Kabbalah, Kabbalah, Kabbalah. What the heck were these people talking about? Kabbalah. And I realized they were saying Kabbalah b'vakasha, which in Hebrew means a receipt, please. I thought these guys were all enlightened or something like that. I couldn't figure it out. Kabbalah means to receive. And so this got me, curious about it. And in 1972, I had an opportunity to be a visiting professor at the University of Paris. And while I was there, I was actually asked to teach in French. Well, I don't speak French at the time, so I went to Alliance Française, and I learned to, quote-unquote, speak French. That was fun. Very difficult language. But while I was there, I got a letter from a friend of mine, Bob Tobin, who was an old high school buddy of mine in high school, and he says, look, I just got this book. He sent me the book. It was called The Cipher of Genesis. And it was a book written by Carlos Suarez, who wrote this book about Kabbalah. And it was a viewpoint that I hadn't heard before. I didn't know anything about Kabbalah anyway. So I was curious. And I found out that Carlos Suarez lived in Paris, where I was teaching. So I decided to visit him. And when I first went in there, I was a physicist and very much a typical kind of physicist, which meant, I had my own narrow way of looking at things. Don't bother me with anything other than my own narrow way. And I met him, and we began to talk, and he asked me what I'm interested in. I said, I'm interested in computers. And he says, okay. And he hemmed and hawed. That was very boring to him. He had no interest in computers. And he said, well, what else? And I said, well, I'm interested in this. And that didn't interest him at all. And finally, I said, well, tell me a little bit about Kabbalah. And he says, well, I think you've been sent here to resist me. I said, well, I said, I don't know. Maybe you were sent to me to resist me. And so we began talking about resistance. And he began to tell me some things. And finally, he started talking about Satan. I thought, whoa, where is this coming from? And he started talking about Satan as being some kind of act of resistance. And in particular, he began talking about how Satan was this kind of energy. And while he was talking, I suddenly started seeing something in my head. Some pictures started to flash in my head. And I began talking about light coming into a cell and bursting it into 1,000 pieces. And he looked at me and he says, finally, someone here who understands Kabbalah. I wonder what Rev Lightman is going to say when he hears that statement about what Satan does. And what got me interested was that somehow there was a science to this thing called Kabbalah, and that there was a way and a method and a technology to it that I had never even heard of before. I mean, I had been studying physics and I knew something about that technology, but Kabbalah as a science was something that never would have even dawned on me. And suddenly this was making some sense to me. Well, later on, as I got more interested in this, suddenly strange things began to happen to me and to my fellows. I was living, this is very funny, last name is Wolf, right? I was living in Paris, and I was sharing a flat with a guy whose last name was Parrott. I'm serious. Michael Parrott and Fred Wolf. And Michael, blessed, nice guy, but very picky, like this, everything had, you can't put that over there, got to be over here, not over here, like that kind of thing, drove me nuts. I mean, I'm not, I'm relatively neat, but I'm somewhat of a slob, and I couldn't, I couldn't figure out what to do with this guy. And then I get a phone call from my friend Bob Tobin. He says, "Oh, you met Suarez?" I said, "Yeah, I met him. I'm coming to Paris. I want to meet him too." I said, "Well, okay. Where am I going to stay?" I said, "Well, I guess you could stay with me." I haven't asked Mr. Parrott, whose apartment I was subletting from, with him in there. He had me and asked him. And then my other friends started calling me. Before long, about 20 people had called me. I don't know how these people even found out. And they all wanted to come to Paris and hang out with Carlos Suarez to learn Kabbalah. And suddenly, Michael Parrott, this is a true story, Michael Parrott gets a phone call from Egypt. And he worked for the Associated Press. And what had happened, or Reuters, one of those two. And what had happened is that somebody called in to say, Anwar Sadat wants to be interviewed by you. Come to Egypt now. This is very, very strange because Carlos Suarez was born in Alexandria, Egypt. He was an Egyptian Jew. And this was to me, this is what is going on here. Does Suarez have connections to Egypt? How did this guy get drawn all the way over there? And he leaves, and suddenly all these people gather in my apartment, and we spend the next 2 weeks learning Kabbalah from Carlos Suarez, who had really interesting insights. And one of the things that happened is that we were stoned on Kabbalah. I don't know how to describe that to you. It's not... It gets you. It really gets you. It gets you where you live. And you find that when people study Kabbalah, it gets them. Because suddenly certain truths about what is going on, what is this happening, begin to become clearer than they were before. And suddenly you begin to see whatever it is that you're working on, whatever it is that you think is the most important thing in the world, begins to kind of dissipate into something less importance. And you begin to see a bigger picture of what's going on. And what emerged for me was something I have said in the film, that I'm living in a great mystery, a great, beautiful, fantastic mystery. And that sense of that mystery filled me and thrilled me better than any thrill or whatever you can possibly imagine. I was really engrossed with this thing. It wasn't just the Kabbalah that engrossed me. It's what I discovered as a result of learning to think in a different way. So what I want to suggest to you in the short time we have here is that Kabbalah and quantum physics, Kabbalah and medicine, Kabbalah and how to improve your tennis game, I mean anything. I don't care what you're doing. There's something about this field of way of thinking, of seeing, which can improve anything. And I don't care if you're a Jew, a Muslim, Gentile, Arab, I don't care what you are. I don't care what nationality, I don't care what religion you belong to. There's something in this that will, I think, awaken something in you. And how it's taught is certainly important, but more important is how it's received. Because you are the result of the Kabbalah. What Kabbalah it means, as I said in my opening, to receive. It's something that you do. Now, what became clear to me is I saw this in relationship to quantum physics, because that was my field. That's what I was interested in at the time. And I began to see certain things that made me think about the human condition in a kind of new alchemical way. Not in terms of the old way, but in terms of something new, where something about consciousness enters into the game. And I began to see a relationship between what's entering into the game, the thing that is conscious, is not just a self, not just a little person inside, not just your body-mind consciousness or your Freudian ego or however you want to talk about it in any way, but something bigger. I call it the spiritual elephant that's in your room that you always think that you can't see. It's there, it's big, it's huge, it's bigger than anything, but to most of us it appears to be invisible. But it probably is what's nudging you into like being in this room right now. It, to me, is the most important thing. And what Kabbalah does is it wakens you up to the elephant that you're riding. You get to experience that. And so, to me, I'm not trying to make it sound like I'm making a sales pitch for Kabbalah. That wasn't my intention. My intention was to share with you some experiences that I had as a result of learning this new kind of thinking. Now, how long have I got here? I think I'm getting close to my end, or what do you think? About 5 minutes? Okay, got 5 minutes. I really, So, as I said, I didn't know what I was going to tell you, but I thought that, I hardly ever know what I'm talking about. Most people are that way, but they don't admit it. For me right now, my whole path and the path that I've taken is one of, I would say, great spiritual awakening. And I take this kind of with humor, but kind of seriously. I see that my job here is not to teach anybody anything. I don't think I could anyway. But my job is, by my experience or by what I say or how I say it or whatever gets you going, is to not enlighten, but to liberate. So Kabbalah will help liberate your mind from any shackles of thought that keep you ensconced or enclosed into a certain way of thinking. And I don't care what you do, there is a way of thinking that you presently have that defines you for every situation you're in. Now, that way of thinking may be, I'm a dad, I'm a mom, I'm a professor of physics, I'm a psychologist, I'm just a little guy, don't bother me, I'm worthless, I'm wonderful, I'm terrible. All those little ways define how you enter into transaction with everybody else in the room, the world, your relationship, your husband, your wife, your spouse, your significant other, whatever, your boss, the guy that works under you especially, whatever. You have a certain way of being with that person. And the whole point of what Kabbalah will help, and what I hope to continue teaching about, is how you can break those shackles which keep you ensconced into only one way of seeing who and what you think you are. And once you begin to see yourself from another point of view, from freeing yourself from those shackles of, I'm only this way, don't bother me, kid, I can't change, you'll be able to see that change is very much a natural part of who you are. And it allows growth and allows transformation. And I think it allows a kind of a spiritual quickening. And now is the time that we all need to have the spiritual quickening. I don't care if you're a complete atheist. I don't care if you believe in nothing. You still have a spiritual quickening. You still have something inside of you that can be awakened. Now, if these words are awakening you right now, you know it. If they're not awakening you right now, then I'm suggesting to you that you've fallen asleep. Thank you.
As you can see, these are not the physicists that I took physics under 25 years ago. No way. Our next speaker is Dr. Satnavra.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here, and in particular I want to thank Rav Lightman and his organization for arranging this. I gather pretty much everybody here saw the film. Is that a fair fair assessment. So I don't have to review anything in it. The film was a very interesting experience. It was an interesting experience for me as well, because I went into it knowing pretty much that the overall point of view was going to be, I would say, how shall I put it? It was going to make grander claims than I would personally make about how far science has gone in confirming spiritual points of view. I consider myself to be pretty intensely religious. I keep a lot of that private, oftentimes, or only talk about it in certain settings. I didn't plan on talking about it in the film. And I have a pretty strong view about what it is that science has and has not actually confirmed in the way of the world of religion, including what it's confirmed or not confirmed about my own points of view. I should also say that over the course of my life, I've changed my mind about so many things that I realize that I've spent most of my life being wrong. So you should take what I say here with a grain of salt. It's clear that the film, You're Being Here, I look back on my own life, that this is an era of intense hunger for some kind of spirituality that is robust and meaningful and that has genuine substance. And it's very interesting that while on the one hand I think people have a tendency to chase after chimeras and illusions, at the same time, even unwittingly, the very same people will nonetheless have a very intense skepticism about something that doesn't produce some kind of tangible result in their life. And that is a consequence of our living in a very materialistic and scientific era. The truth is that maybe 95% of the material elements in this room we're in, for just to use that as an example, our clothing, the lighting, the air conditioning, the electronics of this amplification system, on and on and on and on, are all products of an absolutely mechanistic, deterministic, lifeless view of how the world works. Almost all of modern medicine is based on that premise, and undoubtedly in this audience there are people whose lives have been saved by that lifeless view of human beings as nothing more than a collection of molecules interacting with one another according to completely deterministic and mechanistic principles. So that even people who profess not to believe in that view are, in the modern age, profoundly and deeply affected by it, and in their heart of hearts do believe it. I'm making this argument. I'm saying this as though it's true. Really what you should do is just consider, look inside and ask yourself whether it isn't true. That even people who claim not to believe it, somewhere do believe it. We all participate in the spirit of the age, which has been ever since the Enlightenment, not just on philosophical grounds, and you don't have to be a philosopher, but just simply the relentless triumph of a mechanical and deterministic worldview is so powerful, and we reap so many benefits from it, each of us, that it cannot help but have shaped our outlook on things. And the tacit understanding that there is absolutely no place in that worldview for God, for meaning, for spirit, even for free will, is what propels us to a tremendous hunger for some genuine spirituality, and at the same time, so it will cause us to chase after chimeras, but at the same time, it also provides us with a very serious yearning that any spirituality we come in contact with be genuine and be real. You could put it that science has indeed educated us to be very skeptical of falsehoods of any kind. I was happy to participate in the film because the film opened up a wide variety of very, very interesting perspectives. But I don't think it addressed the question of this skepticism particularly well. Perhaps it will in the forthcoming expanded DVD version. I know that the filmmakers actually are keenly interested in a much more diverse point of view about many of the topics that were raised in it. They didn't want to have necessarily a monolithic point of view, but in the course of a film, you can't kind of go on and on with everybody's different point of view and all the conflicts and so on. With respect to quantum mechanics, this very conflict came up historically, and maybe it will be of some interest to you to know something about this. The founding fathers of quantum mechanics were really just barely out of their teens when they founded it in the early years of this century. Amongst them, there were a minority, Schrödinger, Pauli, a couple of others, who in fact had a conviction that there was something in quantum mechanical theory that did have profound implications about man's spiritual nature or about the nature of the mind, the nature of consciousness, whatnot. They spoke about it more or less cautiously. Schrödinger certainly didn't put any of that in his scientific writings, but he did attend a series of conferences with C.G. Jung at Eranos in the 30s, where he spoke about the relationship between the Upanishads and quantum theory. Pauli was much, much more circumspect. He understood that any potential relationship between the very theories of the specific theories within quantum theory that he was working on, which had the most outrageous implications, the implication that the entire universe is somehow intelligently knitted together instantaneously. He was convinced that there was a profound spiritual implication to that, but he also knew full well two things. One, that perception was going to be exaggerated by non-physicists. And it ran the risk of being turned into a kind of cult-like attitude towards it, that mere analogies were going to be turned into explicit physical theories. And he also knew that if he talked about it too publicly, his career would be wrecked as a physicist. And so he really did very, very little. He only co-published one half of a book with Jung, even though he and Jung and the entire Jungian circle in Zurich were extremely, extremely close. And he was cautioned by his physics colleagues not to even do that, but basically he said, look, I can't completely turn my back on this man. He saved my life. Basically, Jung was Pauli's psychoanalyst for a great many years and did indeed save his life, and it was out of that personal relationship that Pauli's very deep loyalty to the whole Jungian movement grew. But at the same time, he was also fed up with the extent to which many Jungians exaggerated his ideas and incorporated kind of soft versions of physics notions into a Jungian theology. And this is still a problem for people who aren't simultaneously familiar with Jungian theory and physics. Sir Arthur Eddington, in the early years, once wrote something, I don't have the exact quote here, but it's something like that with respect to quantum mechanics, somebody should put up a board saying, work in progress, prying philosophers keep out. Of course, it was too late for that right from the very beginning, because the stuff is just simply too fascinating. And so, in fact, for 80 years, there has always been a school of sometimes top-notch physicists, sometimes not so top-notch physicists, who have a sense that there is something in the core mystery of quantum theory that does have a profound religious implication. Einstein sensed that. and hated it. That's the origin of his often quoted statement, God doesn't play dice with the universe, meaning quantum theory implies that God does, and without going into details of what exactly he meant by that and how it can be interpreted, more or less, and with leaving aside a lot of niceties that really ought to be discussed, Einstein was more or less wrong. And it looks as though, in a certain sense, God does play dice with the universe. That everything isn't all nice and deterministic, that there is an element of complete mystery in how the universe unfolds, at least mystery from the perspective of a physicist. It's not all mechanical. And this has led to tremendously interesting debates in the world of physicists, those who are willing to debate it. There are some physicists who just want to have nothing to do with the debate and who will simply write out the equations that work in the world of physics and then don't think about it. But there are a great many top-notch physicists who are actively engaged in the debate over what this all means. The point I'm trying to make here is that it is an 80-year unresolved debate of incredible fascination as to what it means. No conclusions have been reached yet. Nobody has, I wouldn't say the best people have not reached the conclusion that all is consciousness or that we live in a world of infinite possibilities or a great many other things. However, simultaneously, I think it can be said, well, first of all, it definitely can be said that out of this unbelievably fascinating aspect of quantum theory has arisen a whole new range of technologies that are just amazing. And anybody interested in going into modern physics now is in just for a fantastic treat if they're willing to put themselves through the discipline of learning the mathematics and doing it in a proper way, not just analogizing. Those of you who have kids who are interested in physics, by all means encourage them to go into it because it's just an astounding era that is breaking. And it is also true that, speaking rigorously, we are on the verge of finding for the first time in little baby steps that there does seem to be a role for quantum mechanical effects in the way the brain works, the way the nervous system works. And in my own attempt to penetrate into all this fascinating stuff, which of course could be wrong, but this is just my own attempt, to do it in a way that is rigorous and that doesn't just make gigantic leaps. I have never been able to get any further than simply the observation, which I don't just make it flatly, but try to lay it out in explicit detail, that there apparently is woven into the fabric of the physical universe this capacity for freedom and lack of determinism, lack of machine-likeness that human beings are capable of capturing and distilling, and that it's built into our essence, and it has a very powerful mystical sense to it. Now, practically speaking, it is certainly true in my own experience as a psychiatrist, 30 years of practicing as a psychiatrist before I switched gears and went back to my childhood love, which was physics, that the role of human intention and human will is greatly underestimated. I am not prepared to accept that it is possible for a human being to stop a locomotive bearing down on him on the tracks just by willing it. It's certainly possible, assuming he has the capacity, for a man to step off of the tracks and get out of the way of the locomotive, which is what I would do in preference to testing the hypothesis that I could stop the locomotive. But the understanding that we aren't machines, that there really is this incredible capacity for freedom that each human being has, when an individual grasps that, however they get to it, whether it's through science or without science, that understanding, deeply understood, can I've seen it have an immense impact in people's lives, in people's everyday lives, and in the transformation of, in particular, character. And as far as I'm concerned, in my years of longing and of seeking a life that is spiritually meaningful and deep, in the end, the touchstone of what constitutes, if you will, spiritual development, the evidence, what you look for, is the transformation of human character. And if a person isn't changed into a better person, then all the mystical experiences and all the insights and enlightenment and so on, as far as I'm concerned, really are irrelevant and are of no interest to me, and are of no interest to me in myself either. In the Middle Ages and later, well, earlier and later, there was, in fact, a big upsurge of interest in Kabbalah outside of the Jewish community. This was true in Europe in particular. And there was a group that's known to historians as Christian Kabbalists. And in one of my books, I wrote about the little-known fact that it was out of that group that the entire modern science of cryptology appeared. Actual explicit encoding wheels that were used by the earliest Kabbalists, really 1,500 years before, were adopted by Christian Kabbalists who then began to use them as decryption methods, just not for mystical purposes, but just purely for coding and decoding purposes. Many of those Christian Kabbalists and a few of the original Jewish Kabbalists formed the core of European alchemy. And those of you who are familiar with, in particular, with Jung's understanding of alchemy, or who maybe have other understandings of alchemy apart from the traditional scientific view of it as a precursor of chemistry, understand that the central idea of alchemy was that in this mysterious way, the transformations that were occurring in the matter that the alchemist was working on were somehow really primarily and even more importantly occurring in the character of the alchemist, or in the inner being of the alchemist himself. And ultimately it was the transformation of the alchemist that was more important than the transformation of the material in the beaker. Jung created a purely psychological theory out of that. The film, the discussion here, aims at examining, as it were, the possibility of there being an objective sense in which both things are simultaneously true. That the observer and the observed somehow have a mutuality. And the phrase quantum mechanics meeting Kabbalah suggests that quantum mechanics, or asks the question, does quantum mechanics lead to that conclusion? And I would say that quantum mechanics, at this point of understanding, tantalizingly suggests something in that area to people who are open-minded about that possibility, to physicists who are open-minded about that possibility, but certainly does not confirm anything like that yet. It may take hundreds of years of scientific work before that, if it's true, is demonstrated. And yet, it remains true nonetheless, and I think the very, very best scientists understand this, that even if it's not put in a religious or spiritual framework, that the act of being a true scientist can and should transform one's character. That ultimately the quest for truth has if you will, a component of holiness to it. That ultimately every human being in everything he does is searching, is longing and yearning and searching for that divine spark. So I'll stop my remarks at that point. Thank you all very much.